very strange moment of history, and we are commemorating, if you will, a very contradictory reality. 1948 saw the birth of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the birth of the Convention Against Genocide. It could have set the stage for an era of human rights in the post-World War II era. But 1948 was also the year that gave rise to apartheid in South Africa and to the Nakba in Palestine. And instead of an era of human rights, we saw a continuation of the era of settler colonialism, knowing that settler colonialism, even though it was under attack, it was being ended in so much of the world through brave struggles across Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America. In this case, settler colonialism was not over, and the Nakba of 1948 transformed Palestine. It transformed Palestinian history, and it consolidated one of the last colonial projects in the era of decolonization. Both South African apartheid and the Nakba in Palestine were enabled by Western colonial and imperial interests. South Africa and Namibia are now free, playing an extraordinary role in the world. And now the United States, unlike the earliest stages of the Nakba, but now for sure, the US is the main enabler of the current version of the Nakba, which is underway, particularly what we see in the genocide in Gaza, which is funded and armed by the United States, arming genocide through its provision of military aid, transfer of weapons, and the provision of absolute impunity to the Israeli state for its violations of international law, international humanitarian law, and the human rights of the population. We have already seen in this escalation of the Nakba, we have seen 3 times as many people killed in Gaza, in a very small piece of historic Palestine, than were killed during the original Nakba in 1948. 36,000 people known to be killed, tens of thousands, probably more, buried under the rubble. 15,000 were killed in the period of the Nakba in 1948. 500 villages were destroyed in the Nakba in 1948. In Gaza, we have already seen the destruction of 6 major cities, 8 major refugee camps, and virtually the entire infrastructure of the Gaza Strip, all destroyed. The expulsion and dispossession of 750,000 Palestinians in 1948 in the Nakba has now led to the expulsion and dispossession, in many cases more than once, of 1.3 to 1.5 million of Gaza's 2.3 million people already. And that is underway over and over again on a daily basis. What we see shared in the period from 1948 until 2023 and now 2024 is that none of this was accidental. None of this was simply the unfortunate result of a military battle, because we see the deliberate nature of these attacks. We see the plan, because it's the same plan. The plan for ethnic cleansing, for seizing the land, for settling new colonies on what had been Palestinian land. Before October 7th of 2023, the year 2023, those first 8 months, had already been the bloodiest months across the occupied Palestinian territory since 1948. In the West Bank, there was an escalation of massive number of arrests, of pogroms carried out by settlers in Palestinian villages against those villages, military attacks by Israeli soldiers, the death of more Palestinians than any year before. And in Gaza, that year, a new study was released indicating that in the 16 years of the siege of Gaza, 20% of Gaza's children were already stunted by the age of 2 before October 7, before October 8th and the period since then, that has led to an absolute denial of food, of water, of medicine, of shelter. This was under the easy version of a siege, the easy blockade that lasted for 16, now 17 years. And that was the effect on the children of Gaza already. In that entire period, from 1948 till 2023-24, we have seen absolute impunity for the Israeli state. Since 1967, with the creation of the so-called special relationship between my government, the government of the United States, and the State of Israel, we have seen the absolute impunity guaranteed directly by the United States, including here in the United Nations, where the U.S. consistently uses its veto in the Security Council to undermine efforts at creating a ceasefire, whether it was in 2006 in Israel's war against Lebanon, in 2008 and 2009 in Operation Cast Lead against Gaza, again in Gaza in 2012, again in 2014, in the 55-day assault on Gaza of that year, in 2018, in 2021, and now again, the United States has said we don't need a ceasefire yet. What do they mean? Not enough people have been killed yet? Not enough children have been killed yet? We don't need a ceasefire yet? And in the General Assembly, Excellencies, where there is no veto, let us be very clear that the United States has been extraordinarily successful at using bribes and threats and punishments against those countries that had the temerity to stand up against U.S. domination of this very institution. That's not a new reality. That's something that goes back to the origins of the United Nations, I'm sorry to say. There's not time today to go through that history, but it is a long-standing reality. In the current period, in this escalation that we have seen of the Nakba process that has been underway, the specific intent required by the Convention Against Genocide was made very clear by Israeli officials, military officials, political officials, members of the Knesset, members of the government, the president, the prime minister, the defense minister, other ministers, over and over again, bragging, not afraid, not ashamed, that they were intending to wipe Gaza off the face of the earth, to bring it back to the Stone Age, that they were dealing with animals and not people. They weren't worried about these statements because they knew they had the protection of the United States, that they would never be held accountable. They would not be held accountable in the International Criminal Court. They would not be held accountable by the Security Council. They would not be held accountable by the United Nations itself. And they would not be held accountable in the International Court of Justice. It took the initiative of South Africa, now the Rainbow Nation, the post-apartheid nation, taking that initiative to say to the world that the institutions largely created in the interest of the colonial countries in the post-World War II moment could now themselves be claimed by the once colonized countries. It was a huge victory, even before their ruling, their almost unanimous ruling, that the actions of Israel are possibly genocidal. Those actions were first welcomed by the President of the United States, by President Biden, with a bear hug and with more weapons. The $3.8 billion worth of weapons that the U.S. sends to Israel every year, this year has skyrocketed up to $17 billion worth of weapons. The U.S. is now more complicit in this genocide than it ever has been before, not only because of the weapons that it is providing to carry out the genocide, but because of the impunity, and then the additional weapons on top of that. But this time there are consequences that we are seeing. Israeli cruelty seen across the world, on our screens, on our phones, on our computers, on our tablets, on our televisions, heard on our radios, across the world, has not fallen on deaf ears. There is a movement that has risen across the world to say no. And in that context, across the United States, public opinion has dramatically shifted in a way I never thought I would experience. I've worked on this issue, well, let's just say for a longer time than I care to admit. And I thought I would never see a position in which a U.S. elected official would be threatened with losing their next election because they were seen as being too supportive of Israel. That might happen to President Biden. That's not my choice. That's not something I applaud, because it's resulting from the U.S. complicity in the death of thousands of Palestinians, thousands of children. But what we are seeing is this incredible shift in public opinion, so that 80% of President Biden's own party want an immediate ceasefire, right? We're not surprised to see that this movement that is not new. There has been a movement for Palestinian rights in the United States for decades. If we look back 20, 25 years, that movement has made incredible progress at changing public opinion, at changing media coverage. But it's not anywhere near where it needed to be to actually result in policy shifts. Shifting the public opinion, shifting the media coverage is only step one. It's much more difficult to change the actual policy. But what we've seen here, we saw it earlier in 2023, 44% of Democrats, 44%, said that Israel was like an apartheid state. 2 years before that, in 2021, in a poll of American Jewish voters, 25% of Jewish voters in this country said Israel is an apartheid state, and 38% of young Jews, not my generation, the young Jews, said that Israel is an apartheid state. So what we're looking at now is a movement that has grown from that beginning to something extraordinary that we've never seen, with occupations of the halls of Congress, Jewish Voice for Peace, the organization I am privileged to work with, occupying Grand Central Station, the Statue of Liberty, the resignation of more and more administration officials who say, I cannot work for administration even when I believe in what it is doing on so many domestic issues, but I cannot be part of it when it is carrying out this policy towards Gaza. Rabbis for ceasefire came here to the United Nations. They prayed in the Security Council chambers. They met with the SG on the 38th floor to say, we are here to support the United Nations efforts at creating a ceasefire, and we're here to tell you that we do not stand with our government's refusal to allow the United Nations to do its job. That kind of work has never been seen before. The vote of uncommitted across this country, which is now enough to send delegates to the Democratic Party convention this summer to say, we are going to vote against the support for genocide. We don't know what we're going to do, but we are saying we cannot now vote for someone we see as supporting genocide. This has never happened before. And then on the campuses across this country. 175 campuses at the last count. It's probably more because it's rising day by day, where the tents are going up. You know, the tents were first a symbol of the genocide, the Nakba of 1948. And now the tents have become the symbol of the resistance of students around the world, not only in the United States, across Canada, in Germany, in South Africa, across the world. Students are building encampments on their campuses to be part of a global opposition, to say we need a ceasefire now. And it's not only young Jews, obviously. This is the justice generation. This is the generation in my country that came of age politically in the summer of 2020 with the protests against the police killing of George Floyd, and came to see Palestinian rights as an issue of being against racism, seeing the colonization of Palestinian land as a racist occupation. And that justice generation has been pretty active lately. And they are changing the political character of what political leaders across this country have to take into account. We have been hearing from the administration a new kind of rhetoric. They are hearing these demands. There's no question. They are hearing it. They are changing their rhetoric. At the beginning, it was only about, all we would hear is Israel has the right to self-defense. Israel has the right to protect itself, as if that included the right to impose genocide on an entire population. But now we're hearing that President Biden was brokenhearted when he heard about the World Central Kitchen humanitarian workers being killed, 7 of them. That same day, his administration authorized the sending of 1,000 or more new bombs, including the 2,000-pound bombs, one of which can decimate the structures and the people of an entire city block. So we're hearing a shift in the language. We're not yet hearing the necessary shift in the policy. 3 days ago, we heard about a new shipment of tank ammunition and mortar rounds. This is not the ceasefire that we are demanding yet. The change in the rhetoric at the White House has not been translated into accepting the need for a ceasefire. You know, it took our movement more than 20 years to normalize the understanding that apartheid was the right term for describing Israeli actions in carrying out its occupations throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. It has taken less than 3 months to normalize the term genocide to describe what Israel is doing across Gaza. And because the Israeli actions and its intentions are so clear, that movement is now growing. We still have a huge amount of work to do. We need to unite our movement with the United Nations as a partner. And we know that there is a huge example of how to do that in the years of the 1970s and 1980s in the struggle against South African apartheid, where the United Nations played a huge role in helping to build the global movement against apartheid. And in those years, it was mainly in the General Assembly, because like now, the Security Council had a veto, and the US, often Great Britain as well, over and over and over again would veto any resolution calling for sanctions against the apartheid regime in Pretoria. But somehow those resolutions kept getting passed in the General Assembly, urging member states to impose an arms embargo, to impose a trade embargo, to stop allowing the apartheid government in South Africa from having access to the global banking system. And over again, we would hear in the United States, oh, don't worry, it's not binding in international law. But somehow, country after country, faced with protest after protest in their own countries, using the statements and the resolutions of the General Assembly as evidence, came to their governments and said, this is your obligation. And we are demanding, we the people of your country, are demanding that you carry it out, whether or not it's legally binding according to the UN Charter. And what do you know? One day in the 1980s, enough countries had done that, enough allies of the United States had done that, that the United States itself finally gave in, and the Congress passed a resolution calling for sanctions against apartheid South Africa. And yes, then President Reagan vetoed the resolution, but that veto was overturned by the Congress. That's what we need to do. South Africa showed us the way with its recent initiative in the International Court of Justice, challenging the U.S. guarantee of impunity for Israel. The ICJ ruling is now a tool of global civil society to hold up to our governments, demanding that your governments, excellencies, the governments that all of you represent, who now have this obligation, most of your governments are signatories, are state parties of the Genocide Convention. And unlike most conventions, the Genocide Convention puts obligations on every state party, not only on the country being accused of violating the terms, but on every country that is a state's party to the Genocide Convention. There is the obligation to work to prevent genocide, and if a genocide occurs, to do everything in your power to stop it. You have the model in the resolutions that were passed and how they were implemented during the years of struggle against South African apartheid. It's your opportunity to be on the right side of history. The committee can take the lead with Palestinian and global civil society to bring the UN as a whole back to doing what the Charter says it was created to do, to stop the scourge of war. And doesn't that have to also mean to stop the scourge of genocide? Even when that genocide is being enabled by the most powerful member state of this organization? We have a lot of work to do. We start with the demand for an immediate and lasting ceasefire, and we move on from there. We have a lot of work to do. Thank you.